Good morning. Appreciate everyone's attendance this morning, and as we continue this series on the family, I'm going to continue a portion of the big overview of what family is and what it means to us, and I leave the practical to Mike and Michael, but try to give once again, just an overview of where we are in God's plan and how the family is integrated into that plan. And with that, kind of the rough outline that I've been looking at and trying to put together these lessons is looking at these three phases of life that we kind of enter into here on this earth. And we've been spending a lot of time on looking at the beginning, talked about children, and how they are a key integral part of God's plan for us and for the continuation of His knowledge of Him throughout history and into the future. And this morning, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the middle. When we look at this time as a time of training and fortification of the family and taking that godly seed that has been given to us and what we do with it, and also just understanding the influences we have on one another, even here as the church, as we make sure and lay a foundation for passing on those things that God has shown us through history and through each of our own lives. And then we'll conclude, and as we continue this series, we'll look more on into the passing on of wisdom and faith, which we'll touch on some this morning as well. But the key thing in all of this is looking at the idea of multi-generational faithfulness and the idea that God has established in all that He has done, this idea that we must, and when it's incumbent upon us as one of our primary roles on this earth, is to not only know God, but to make sure others know of Him. And where that starts and where it's key is more than any place is in the home. And to make sure that we understand this. And in the context of this is the idea that if we look at 2 Corinthians 10, the idea that we are in a spiritual war. You know, I think all of us recognize that we look at each and every day when we walk out into the world, or you turn on the television, or you have a conversation with someone, or you get on the internet, that the culture is not for us. We are not moving in a direction. And in fact, never have we ever been moving in the right direction. It just seems to ebb and flow. And when it seems like maybe we're gaining a little bit of ground and maybe when we're losing ground. And I don't know about you, but you know, I started my family some 25 years ago, and I had concerns and I had worries. And I don't think I would have imagined in 25 years we'd be where we are today. And the things that I would have to be worrying about and the things that I would have to be talking to my family about, and I almost think, wow, could it get much worse? Well, yes, it can get a lot worse, but we have to recognize that in the tools that God has given us, the family and how we manage it is one of the key weapons that we have against this spiritual warfare. That Satan is constantly after us. He's constantly trying to undermine us. He's constantly trying to stop the hope that comes through the knowledge of God being transmitted to the next generation. And so with that, we have to be sober and vigilant in all that we do. As we says in 1 Peter, and he acknowledges that we need to be vigilant in all that we do because Satan is constantly present. He's sitting there, he's crouching beside you, and he is waiting for the opportunity to pull you away from God and take you away from Him and make you feel alone. And so with that, we have to understand that Satan has always been and always will be playing the long game. And I know at times, and it's easy for me, and I can look at a lot of things that I do in my life, in my day-to-day, says I worry about what's just around the corner, those things that are right in front of me. And it's important that we address those things, and it's important that we handle those things, but we also have to be thinking about the bigger picture because Satan is. And we can't just be looking at these current challenges, but understand that God has given us a framework. He's given us the family. He's given us the church, who is our Christian family. to ensure the continuation and the knowledge of him, so that those now and into the future will have the hope that comes through the knowledge of God. Because we have to understand that the problem in this world is that they have no hope. They have nothing to hold on to. They have nothing that can give them any kind of certainty and security, so they're grasping for anything that's in front of them that they think is going to give them that. And Satan is more than happy to offer them what appears to be something that can give them hope. And so in Mark 5 and 13 through 15, we are given a mission to say that we are the light of the world. We are the salt of the earth. We are that city on the hill. And I would propose that a vision that we should have for our families is to be that city on the hill, to be that shining light. And then how do we guarantee that? How do we assure that? Well, that's kind of where we're going to start this morning. And looking at Psalms 78, which Larry read for us, we see this as a psalm of Asaph. He was a songwriter for David. And he presents, and this is one of the longest psalms in the Bible. We're only going to talk about the first 8 verses, but it's kind of the preamble to a psalm that talks about the history of what God did for Israel and walks through. And so it really is just a history lesson for those that listen to it. But he talks about here in this, the rationale for it, and we're going to spend some time on this morning. And then we're going to deviate from there, and we're going to go to Jeremiah 29, and we're going to look at some practical applications of what this is said. So we start in Psalms 78. And we look here, and it says, "Give ear, O my people, to my teachings. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open up my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of the old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from our children, but tell them to the coming generation the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach to their children, to that next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God." So we see the first thing is he's telling me, listen up. Hear what I'm about to say. I'm about to tell you something. I'm going to open my mouth in a parable, which we know what that means, a story. We're going to talk about some things. But then he goes on and he says, don't forget these things that I have done. So we don't forget. And we see this in parallel in many other verses in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy 31, when he's calling together, he says he assembles all and he teaches all the people those things that God has told them. In Joshua 8, he speaks of teaching to the young and to the old, the importance of all those things that the Lord has done for them. And even in Proverbs 3 and 1, he says, don't forget these teachings. And so we see in this psalm, it talks about these dark things. I said, well, utter dark sayings of old, things that I have heard and known. And really when he talks about this, what are dark sayings? Or it says in some versions, dark things. And he's really talking about the words of the wise. Those things that have been passed down from their forefathers, those that have lived their lives and bring forth those things that are important to us. And so he's talking about that multi-generational communication that happens and the importance of that. And with that wisdom of old, with those things that we should do know what? We go in, if we looked at this, we should not hide them from their children. So what does that mean, we should not hide them? Do we hide things from our children? There's certainly things I don't tell my children, but he's telling this is one of those things you should not hide from your children. Now, can I hide this from my children? I can, because sometimes if I don't share with them the things they ought to know, I am, in effect, hiding things from them. So the importance of this is, to me, is saying that there is things that we will keep from our kids, but this is not one of them. This is something we should be sharing with them each and every opportunity we have. In fact, in Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 11, we remember those phrases of teaching them diligently to our sons and daughters, and talk with them as you sit down, as you walk along the way, that these things should be incorporated in our day-to-day lives. These are things that should happen organically in all the things that happen in our lives, that we should take the opportunity, that we should be focused and intentional in these communications with them. In fact, in the New Testament, we look at Ephesians 6. It says, bring them up in discipline and instruction of the Lord. And then also we see in 2 Timothy 3, and it's talking about committing everything that you have learned. And remember who taught you the teachings of the sacred writings that lead to wisdom and the knowledge of salvation. And that really is the final result. We're teaching these things, these sacred writings, these dark things, these dark sayings, these wisdoms of old, so that we'll have wisdom of what? The knowledge of salvation. Because it's looking at, as parents, as grandparents, as brothers and sisters in Christ, should our not focus be on the fact that we want to save everyone that we know? And most importantly, and probably most focused currently in my life, is making sure that my children are saved and know those things that God has taught them, has taught me, and I've learned from those wiser than me who have been taught to me over the years. And then finally, and then he goes on to talk about the testimony of Jacob and appointed the law. And so we look at these things, and in Deuteronomy 11, we go back then, and it says of these things of the law that we should write them down and we should put them on our doorposts. So we hear this in these instructions that Moses gave, the idea of these laws, these rules, these guidances that have come from God in the old law were so important that not only do you talk about them, but you write them down. And you even go to the point of that you put them over your doorposts so that you see them every time you walk in and out of the door. That it's something that's at front of mind whenever you're leaving the home and entering the home, that you understand these things. And so through this psalm, he's talking about these things. Remember that we are commanded to teach them to our children. This isn't a suggestion. This isn't when you can. This is a commandment that we teach these. And why do we do this? Why do we do all of these things? Because in the end, that the next generation might know them. Because this is that idea of multi-generational communication, and we're passing down a multi-generational faithfulness to our families and to our friends. That we know that this teaching will bear fruit, not only to our generation and to our children's generation, but to their children's and their children's. And the key thing I want to take from this is just understanding that when we do anything, when we are focused on anything, it's not just looking at now, because what we do now has great importance. But how we do it and how focused we do it, and if we follow what God has asked us to do, we will see the fruit of this not now, but into the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. And in fact, that's God's whole point. You're not doing it so you can see it. You're doing it to guarantee that your children's children see it, because that's how God intended it to be. Because that faithfulness in the end, what it does is we do all of this, it says here in this psalm, so they should set their hope in God. And that is where that's where the crux of everything is. What did we talk about? I said earlier, what's the problem with this world? What is the issue that they don't have? They don't have hope. They may think they have hope. They may put their hope in things, but they're always disappointed if they put their hope in something of this world, because it never holds up. It never delivers the peace that God's hope gives us. It doesn't give us the certainty that God hopes gives us. Because the big issue we have with all of this, and looking at this hope with God, is that if we look at Hebrews 6 and 11, the full assurance of this hope does one thing: it motivates us. And in fact, it says it doesn't make us sluggish when we look at our lives. It gives us purpose. It gives us this motivation that we imitate those who we've seen in faith, and we have inherited this promise of what? That the promise that we have salvation in him through Jesus Christ, and we have a hope in heaven. Because in the end, that's the end motivation, isn't it? To be with God again, to restore that relationship that we've lost with him. And that's not something the world even understands. And it's something that can be lost in just the blink of an eye, because the world can come in and can wipe all of that away if we don't hold to our role in teaching this to our children, knowing that they should be teaching it to their children, and that they will communicate to their children. They need to teach it to their children. Because it's not something just for me to tell my children about these things, my kids, or to tell my brothers and sisters about these things, or my friends, but you also have to add into that indoctrination of this importance that you have to spread that to others. You have to continue it. That is a key piece of where we are in multi-generational faithfulness, to keep those commandments and remember the blessings of God. And all this, the side benefit of all this is you don't end up making the mistakes that those that forget. Because those that forget end up being what? I'm stubborn. I'm rebellious. That's easy for me to say that that's a default switch that we all probably live in. But the end result is with that, if we don't pass this on, we end up with a generation that's not steadfast, and they end up losing faithfulness to God. And Israel's history is full of these episodes. So we understand that what he says here is true. And the psalmist is giving us this guidance. But in the end, we're looking for that hope that God has given us. And the thing about hope in God is, I can say I'm hopeful that the weather's good tomorrow. But how much certainty do I have in that? Not a lot. Because the weather could be one thing. The weatherman could even tell me that there is 70% certainty. But very often do they ever say it's 100% certain that the weather's going to be that way? If it says if you go and pull up your ESPN app and it says there's a 95% chance that OSU is going to beat Iowa State, and then it doesn't happen, there wasn't 100% certainty in that. But earthly hope doesn't have certainty. But godly hope, it is not only a desire that something good is going to happen in the future, but we expect it to happen. Because God's faithfulness, as shown through history, is solid. His sovereignty is complete. And that we can express that hope and know that full assurance, as it said again, we talked about in Hebrews 6, that full assurance of hope until the very end of time that we have. So with that and looking at that, we just don't forget the hope that God has set, and we don't forget. So let's remember those pieces as we kind of segue into this next part of my lesson. I'm going to take, I was doing this study and looking at different things, I came upon a portion of the letter in Jeremiah when he was talking to the Babylonian exiles in Jeremiah 29. And I think it demonstrates in practicality the need for a multi-generational vision, and how God, throughout the course and time of human history, has always relied upon us looking at multi-generational vision. But when he's talking to the exiles there, they have just been moved into Babylon, and he is going to give them a promise to that exiles and give them some instructions. And through that, to them to follow it, they had to have a multi-generational perspective on that. And to kind of set up things in Jeremiah 29, just to kind of give you where it was, what was going on there. A group of Jews, through the instructions of the king of Israel at that time, king of Judah at that time, sent a group to Babylon under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar. And they were now there, and they had just started to settle in this new land. And there was a lot of different talk going on. In fact, there was false prophets going, this is just a short-term thing, guys. You're not going to be here very long. God's going to get us back home. We don't have to worry about things. And that was very prevalent. And so there was a lot of folks that were kind of just, let's just see if we can slog through this and we'll get back home soon. But in fact, Jeremiah delivered a different message. And it wasn't as popular and it didn't stick because he said, you're going to be there for a bit. This isn't going to be just you're going to get over there, you're going to be in there for a few years, and then God's going to restore us and return us back home. In fact, you're going to have to settle in because this is going to take a while. And if we go to Jeremiah 29 and starting in verse 10, we see that he says there, for thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill you my promise and bring you back to this place. So with this, if someone says in 70 years something's going to happen, I know personally it means I'm not going to see it. It's not going to happen. I do not see myself living to an age of 120. I don't know that I want to live to an age of 120. But he's delivering a message, and when we look at this, is understanding that he delivers a message that you are not going to see home again. You're not going home. The ones that were listening, you don't get to go home. What's the one thing they want to do? If you're in exile and you're living in Babylon, where do you want to be? You want to be home. But he's delivering this message that you're not going to get to see it. And that's not what they wanted to hear. But he gives them this and tells them these things. And this captivity is going to last for 70 years. And so you're going to have to set your focus forward and who is going to actually fulfill this promise. It's not going to be me. It may not even be my kids. It'd be my kids' kids before the ones that are going to actually go back and see Jerusalem again. And we have many examples of this and this idea. And that's why I think focusing on this and understanding where this is, because he gives them a promise, much like Abraham was given, Isaac and Jacob, of things that were going to happen, but they were never going to see the true fruits of it. But they had to remain faithful, and they kept communicating that promise to the next generation and the next generation in the hopes of knowing that it was going to be fulfilled. Because in this, the promise that was given, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. So when any time that God gives us a promise, there's always the hope of when it's going to be fulfilled. And so these folks had to look at this and understand that that wasn't going to happen today, tomorrow, next week, next year, in 10 years, in 20 years. 70 years from now, this is going to be fulfilled. And that message of hope they had to hold to is that God always promises a brighter future. He's promising the restoration of them back to their homeland, but it's not going to happen right now. And it parallels so many things that we see, like we said in history. It also parallels where we are today, that we have a hope in seeing heaven one day, and we'll know we'll see it, but we don't know when that's going to happen. And we don't know if our kids are going to see it, our grandkids are going to see it, our great-grandkids, or if it's going to happen 1,000 years from now. But the importance of it is that I, in my mind, and as a family, and as a father, am focused on the fact that I want my kids and my kids' kids and my kids' kids and my kids' kids to have the same hope that I have. I don't want them to have the hope, the empty hope that I see this world has, and that we are commanded to pass this down. Because in the end, we all want a hope in a future, and something where we sing things better than what they are now. And the world provides a lot of things that says that they're going to give you hope and give you a brighter future. In fact, I can remember things 20 years ago that were supposed to make everything better. And guess what? They didn't. Because they were rooted in man. They were rooted in things that were not of godly wisdom and godly hope. In Psalm 78, we go back to and says, that origin of godly hope comes from the teaching of the word to our children and our children's children. That's how we get that hope to be transmitted through the generations. And so this promise that was given to them specifically to these exiles doesn't necessarily pertain directly to us. We can't apply this to us directly because it wasn't written to us. It was written to these people at this time. And I think it's interesting, and this is a side note on this, is a lot of times we hear this verse and they talk to us about how it's supposed to give us a lot of encouragement and how we look at this, but the truth of this is these plans that he had for them were for them. These aren't the plans that he had for us. We have a different blueprint that's given us through the New Testament and through the teachings of the gospel. But in the end, we all want a future, a hopeful future. But in this, if we bounce back up and we look back to this, just before this, and we back up to verses 4 through 7, the first part of Jeremiah 1 through 3, he's basically outlining a historical lineage of who he's talking to, where they've gotten into this situation, who's been in leadership. But then he follows up with this, and he says in verse 4 that he says, "Thus the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all who were carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon." And we'll stop here and pause a moment on this. Because in this, all who were carried away, whom I have caused to be carried away. Because in this, the big piece that we see with this is that God's establishing his sovereignty when he's talking to them. So here's these exiles. He's later on going to give them this promise. He's going to tell them in 70 years something's going to happen. Why should I believe that? Because guess what? I've put you where you are today. You are in Babylon because I put you in Babylon. And so he's establishing a sovereignty there of who he is, and that though things maybe seem like they're not going the way the exiles want it to go, God has them where they're supposed to be. And then with that, we go on to the next verse. He starts describing over the subsequent verses how they are supposed to be in the place that God has put them. And hopefully I'm going to carry through some principles I think we can get from this. Because God put them there. So he says the first thing. So once again, they're in Babylon. This is not a God-fearing city. In fact, when I read this, I was like, I feel like I'm in Babylon. I'm in a place where everything else around me really isn't interested in fortifying or building up what I believe or who I want to be. But what does he tell them to do? He tells them to build houses and live in them. And he's telling them this before he's telling them it's going to be 70 years before I get there. But he's telling them, build houses and live in them. Establish yourself in this land, in this city in which you're living. And live your lives as you would if you were going to be here. You were going to establish yourself. He doesn't tell them to put everything in your backpack and get ready so when I come, you can move on. He's saying build houses and live in them. And then even more so, he says, plant gardens and eat their produce. So not only are you building houses in this place, but then you're going to turn around and you're going to plant fields and you're going to build yourself a society and a culture and a place there, a community, that not only can you establish yourself and put in deep roots, but you can support yourself while you're there. In a place that I don't want to be, but he says you put down deep roots. And why are you putting down deep roots? That starts to make sense, because then it says that take wives and have your sons and daughters take wives for your sons, and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there, and do not decrease. You're building these houses, you're laying down these fields, because guess what? You're going to sit here in this place you don't want to be, and you're going to prosper. And you may not prosper in the ways you thought you were going to prosper, but you're going to continue to have families, you're going to have generations. And we understand as we read this why you're going to have to do this, because we're going to be here for 70 years. But you have to make sure and assure that you've put yourself in a place where you've set yourself up for success to be able to do this and sustain your families and do these things. And then finally, and he says, but, and I think that's something to be said about that, because if you're in a place you don't want to be with a group of people that don't really agree with who you are and what you want, and in fact, they've taken you captive, do you really want to do this? But seek the welfare of the city where I, again, he established that, so I have sent you here into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare. So this is where it gets hard. I'm in a place I don't want to be. Okay, I'm building my house. I'm establishing a means of supporting myself. I'm planting those fields. I'm having children, and I'm having them have children. I'm looking at this multi-generational growth of my family to sustain themselves. But then I need to be a blessing to where I am. I need to be a support to that city where I am. In fact, I need to pray for that city and that country and that land and that situation that I'm in, because God put me there. And as it goes is how I go. And if I'm trying to see my family and see it extended and move on from generation into generation and see that multi-generational perpetuation of the knowledge of God, where I'm at needs to be in a place that is supporting me and making sure that can happen. You know, and God has done this over and over again. It's one of those things that I think is uniquely not intuitive to us as humans, is that you put you in a bad spot and you actually grow and you prosper. We see it with the Israelites in Egypt. We see it over and over again, and we see it here in the exile, that he always sometimes put a remnant in a really bad place, in a situation that's far from ideal, and he says, do what I tell you to do, and I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to take care of you. But you just need to follow what I've asked you to do. And so with this, we see in Jeremiah, we've got these principles and what we're looking at, and to be a blessing to where you are, because guess what, guys? I can just tell you, I'm not really thrilled with a lot of things our culture and society have decided to do, especially over the last 3 years. Feels like the last 3 years we have been in a free fall of things that have been worries and concerns. And I will tell you that my general idea was, how can I isolate myself from all this? How can I get myself away? Nothing better than 15 acres out in the middle of nowhere. Get me everything I need, and I can just live my life. I can raise my family, and I don't have to deal with all of this. But that's not what he calls us to do. He doesn't call us to do that. He tells us we have been placed where we are. We are all here today because God has said this is where he wants us to be. In whatever situation we're in, this is where he wants us to be, and we have to be present, established, putting down deep roots, finding a way to support ourselves. And that is not my tendency. In fact, I want to isolate everybody, but then I've had to learn how I just need to insulate. We've got to have an insulation. And that's what the family unit and what this church does. It provides us insulation. We exist within a climate and a culture, but we're insulated from it because we have the support of each other. We have the knowledge of God and the hope that he's given us that we can cling to when all of this other stuff is just getting dumped on us and dumped on us. Because every time we walk out of this building or I walk out of my house, and it's all for all of us, you feel like you're on your own. And you may be in a workplace where things are not necessarily the most edifying. You may have people that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis that don't necessarily push you to be better than who you are. They may be pulling you in the other direction. But with this and this idea of this hope that comes through God, we need to make sure that we look to him and to look to this multi-generational ideas. And so when we look at multi-generational vision, and this is something I'm going to spend a little bit more time on my next installment, but this idea, if we look at multi-generational vision, it's got some components, and this is by far not exhaustive, it's just some things to think about. Is that one of the big things is we want to pass on the faith we have in God to our families. I think that's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? We beat that over and over again through all the different things we see, and we see God saying it over and over again. We see it telling it to the Israelites again and again and again. Teach and pass on this faith. But we also need to teach God's blessings and what he's done for those that follow him faithfully, because that's where hope starts to grow, because I have a proof of those things that have happened and that we can hold on to. We look at godly values and those things that when we look at the world and how we try to adjust to what's being presented in front of us, how do we look at that in the prism and through those, what I call biblical glasses in these situations to make decisions on that. But multi-generational vision provides that if we do that. We need to establish godly traditions. This, I think, is on a huge assault currently in our society because we are presently, I feel like, in the mode of throw everything out that's ever been done in the past because it's no good. In fact, most of it's just evil in the sense of the world's eyes. But that we need to establish traditions that help build up and show that faith that God has in us, the blessings that he's given us, and reinforces those values. Establish the importance of God and his love for us and how we care for one another. And all those things come as we look at multi-generational vision. We need to look at building a sense of ownership. And this was kind of spoke upon with Jeremiah, that we need to look at where we are and own what we have and understand the togetherness that comes with that. But finally, we need to really look at imparting godly purpose and hope. Because in the end, hope is what anchors all of us. It's what's going to keep you faithful because you know that there's an outcome that's positive at the end. And that Jeremiah is telling them some basic things in order to do that and how we can impart that. And where I think this becomes practical and just kind of review kind of the takeaways from this morning that I had from this is that one, we need to build and establish our homes. Wherever we are and whatever we're doing, we need to build our homes, and we need to build them on solid ground. But we need to build them because we need a place of shelter. We need a place to live, to sustain us for life, but also to provide us a place that we can get away from the world, that we can focus on those things that are important as a family and as a church. But we need to build a place that we go to. And what Jeremiah was talking about was a physical place, which I think we all know we need a physical place of shelter. But also recognize you need to build a spiritual home that have a place where you can go and you can be safe from the pressures and strains of the world. And then also we need to plant our gardens. We need to plant, and when you look at this, the basic things we need in this life is you need shelter, you need food, you need water. and clothes are nice. But you've got these basic things, and so with it, in this looking at this, you need to plant our gardens. We need to make sure that we're establishing a way that we can support ourselves. And I can tell you, when you talk about multi-generational legacy, and you talk about it in the faith-based world or even not, there's a lot of conversations about assuring financial security and knowing where you've got things. And there's a piece to that that can be said, that we're trying to make a place where we not only are looking ourselves, but looking support forward. And we could spend some time on that, but I'm really looking at planning that support in the sense of, what are we doing to make sure that people, that our children and our families and our church have a place to go where they can continue to get nourished on the things that God has taught us? What are the means and the mechanisms we have to make sure that we have that place, that we can get that and they can go back to that when they need it? Because we all need it. We all get hungry again. We all need something to sustain us. And this idea of multi-generational faithfulness is the key component that we have to establish those things. And when we do that, we eat those fruits. We go back to that. We sustain ourselves with those things. That labor has some benefit to us. But that as families, what are we doing? Where are we at with that? What are we looking forward to intentionally that not only will feed us and our current generation, but will sustain the next generation and the next generation? Because once again, multi-generational thinking means I'm not looking at today, I'm not looking at next month, I'm looking at to the next generation and the generation after that, and what are we doing to establish that? And then we need to grow our families. Because I think it's interesting when you looked at this admonition that you need to go ahead and have your kids get married, and their kids get married, and everyone get married, because what happens whenever there's stress? Whenever there's economic stress, whenever there's war, whenever all these things happen, you know what happens to the birth rate for us? It doesn't go up. It goes down because we're not certain of where things are going to be. And God says you just need to go on and you need to continue to grow, because that's how I'm going to be known into the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. That's the key component of that. So we have to continue on. We can't let ourselves buy into that, oh, it's going to look really bad. Because, you know, right now I could say I don't really know that I want my kids to live in this next 20 years. Not really thinking that's something that looks like it's going to be easy. And the tendency would say, oh, this is, and in fact, you hear it, I don't want kids to grow up in that world. In fact, why would I want to have kids? I mean, we see the world, that sentiment is deep and prevalent now. We look at a place where the world is going to be so bad in 20 years that adding more people to it is just a crime. It's just cruel. But that's not what God says. He says, grow your families. Why? Because that's how we assure that the next and the future generations know who God is, because we establish those families. We put all these things in place so that they will be here. Because guess what? If Jesus Christ has not come, they need someone that has built a house, that has planted a garden in place so that they can know who God is. And who is that? That's us. That's what he's telling them. That's where we are. That's us, that we have to do that. And that we just need to be a blessing wherever we are. We need to work on the welfare of wherever we are, whatever job you're in, wherever you're living, in the city in which we live, the state and the country in which we live, we need to be somewhere where we're beneficial. That's what he calls us to be. You know, and that can be hard sometimes to figure out how is that. But just honestly, guys, when I look at it, because you sit there and try to see what it is, it's just doing the things above it. Because people will see it. Some people won't believe it. Some will be stubborn. Some will have hardened hearts. That's always going to be here. It's always been here. But be a blessing wherever you are and work to do that in all that you do. And we just need to pray. We just need to pray for the country in which we're in, the city in which we live, that it will be what God wants it to be in order that we may continue to be who he needs us to be, whatever that looks like. Because like I've said before, this world that I'm looking at isn't anything what I thought it was going to look like when I was 20 years old, or 25, 26 when my first kiddo came, and I had visions of what that was going to look like. It's very different. And I'm sure those of you that have been here even longer than me have the same sentiment of things, because the change has been real. But we just need to pray for our country. So with all of this, when I look at it, I try to just put it in context of everything and say, okay, how's this all going to be real? I keep going back to, man, it's really hard if I'm in a place where I don't necessarily feel like I want to be where I am. How do I do all these things and do it fully? And I just go back to this, and this is kind of becoming my verse for the last couple of years. I think in the midst of all the turmoil that I've seen in my life, that you look back and you look to the example of Jacob. You know, when he's going up, and this is the time when he is going, and he puts up this pillar of stones at Bethel, and he goes and he makes this vow: if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I come back to my Father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. You know, Jacob's just sitting there. You just give me the basics, Lord, and I'm going to call you my God. You know, we've got a lot. I can never say that I am not. I am blessed beyond any means that I have ever deserved. And I think almost all of us can say that. You know, we look at the world as a whole, we are wealthy and rich in the material sense beyond all measure in all of human history. But if you look at this and we just understand that the idea is, of God, if you just take care of me, and he promises that he will, and we've seen it through the course of human history, because that is our hope, then our response back to him is that we will be faithful to him, and that we will call him our God. So looking at multi-general faithfulness and this whole idea, and just looking at this whole context of all this, is that God's going to take care of us, and all he asks us to do is to make sure we tell others about him. That's in the Great Commission that we hear this, but it's also in our day-to-day lives as our family in some practical ways. And so hopefully in the next installment, I want to talk a little bit more about some practical ways that this can be implemented and look at some things. But just go back and recognize those things, and just, it hit me really hard that it was pretty simple what Jeremiah told those folks that were in a place that they didn't necessarily want to be. But in order to fulfill that multi-generational promise, because that was the idea, this was what it was going to take to meet and be part of that promise that he had given them in those 70 years, was to build a house, to plant your garden, to eat of that fruits of those labors, to do those things, to have families, and to promote those families, and pray for the land in which you are living, and hope for them and the promises that come with that. That's the message I have for this morning. I appreciate your kind attention on that. If anyone here today has any desire to put on baptism, we can arrange that. Even though the baptistry here is not quite ready, we can make that. But if you have that desire and have made that decision this morning, we offer that to you. If you need prayers of the church, if you find yourself struggling and want us as a collective group to pray for you, know that the power of prayer is powerful. And we ask you to come forward as we stand and sing this next